This is the lecture for Maureen Ramsay's chapter, Democratic Dirty Hands. I couldn't find a picture of Maureen Ramsay, so this is a picture of uh, a temple to the Emperor Ashoka, a Buddhist temple to the Emperor Ashoka in China that I visited once. Let's see, consequentialism, the first topic. So uh, Ramsay talks about consequentialist defense of lying. And so, two things to say about this. One is that um, it's interesting to think about to what extent is the Brennan thing that we read last time a consequentialist defense of lying or not. Um, that's something to think about. And then, second, just what does she mean by this? And more broadly, what is consequentialism? So, we've learned about utilitarianism at some point in this class, and utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. Consequentialism says, do whatever leads to the best consequences. And utilitarianism says, specifically, the best consequences are measured in terms of utility. And then utility, you may recall, is in terms of like pleasure and pain or satisfied preferences or something like this. So consequentialism is about, it's a moral theory or a political theory, and it says, do whatever leads to the best consequences. So when she's talking about consequentialism, that's what she has in mind. What kind of consequences might we care about? Well, the utilitarian has a suggestion for what kind of consequences we might care about. But there are other kinds of consequentialists. She's not really specific about the kind of consequentialism she has in mind because she's kind of opposing this sort of view. And also, she doesn't need to be very specific because, broadly speaking, no matter what kind of consequentialist you are, probably you'll care about sort of like everybody reaches more or less the same conclusions on most of the questions. So like, does a consequentialist want us to, set fire to everything? I mean, no matter what you think good consequences are, setting fire to everything is probably not going to accomplish good consequences. So even though there's differences between kinds of consequentialisms, all the plausible ones will sort of line up on saying, bad things are bad and good things are good. Second, realism. So she talks about realism in the article. It comes up when she starts talking about the national interest on page 30 and so forth. And so we've seen realism in this class before when we read Williams. Williams was defending realism about political theory. And the kind of realism she's talking about in this article is not the same kind of realism. There's a different kind of realism. This is realism in the field of international relations, or IR. And the kind of realism she's describing here is associated with, she cites Hans Morgenthau here, people like this. And so there's, I don't know, in a way, there's some link between realism Williams style and realism Morgenthau style, but like mostly they're separate things. The kind of realism that's involved in international relations is sort of, um, I don't know, it's a combination of two things. The biggest part of realism is sort of a hypothesis about how to understand what states do. And the realist says the way to understand state interactions is basically through the lens of power and self-interest or national interest, because we're talking about states. So states, according to the realist, are going to pursue power because in this sort of international sphere, it's effectively like anarchy. Nobody's in charge. And so the only way to stay safe, the only way to protect yourself is to get as much power as possible so that others cannot sort of dominate you. And so according to the realist, this is how we should sort of understand relations between states. It's kind of a power struggle, ultimately. And so that's the main part of realism about international relations. A sort of secondary part of realism about international relations is that if everything is a power struggle, then sort of moral concerns kind of have no place. So if you're trying to figure out like what does it make sense for a state to do, and you think the answer is always do whatever gets the most power, of course sometimes you can do immoral things to acquire more power. And so there's a strand in realism that says forget all this petty morality stuff. States are going to ignore it, and they should ignore it because what they need is power to protect uh, the national interest. So you can sort of imagine a link between realism Williams style and realism Morgenthau style, because for Williams, the central political question is sort of avoiding anarchy at the national level. So sort of making sure we don't all sort of end up fighting each other. Rather, we exist in a sort of peaceful political state. And then you might think that in order to achieve this on the national level, we will need enough power to sort of protect us internationally from people attacking us. So maybe we should be realists on the international level, because otherwise there won't even be a politics to talk about at the national level. So that's a way you could link them, but at least at the level that we're looking at things in this class, basically realism in political theory is kind of separate from realism in international relations, because realism in political theory is about sort of what is the concern of political theory. It's meeting the basic legitimation demand, as Williams puts it, which is, making sure we have a state where everybody's not just killing each other. And the stuff that flows from that, realism in international relations, is a separate sort of thing about how to understand international affairs. So mostly separate. And finally, this is not, I don't know, super important, but it might be something kind of confusing when you read through the chapter, and it's also an interesting point, like aside from this reading. So on pages 27 through, well, mostly 28 and 29, and then later 34, 35, she talks about, she's been talking about the consequentialist defense of lying, and she says these defenses, so the consequentialist defenses of lying, are not, but could be defended as, a just lie theory, analogous to a just war theory, which does not push immoral means beyond the scope of moral judgments by merely defending them as necessary for success. Just as in the idea of a just war, ethics requires necessary discrimination between legitimate and illegitimate uses of force. Just as in the idea of just war, ethics requires necessary discrimination between legitimate and illegitimate uses of force. So the idea of a just lie could be said to require a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate uses of deception. So the thought is, well, actually first, the idea of a just war theory. So this is something we're not looking at in this class because it didn't win any votes, but that's okay. Just war is sort of about when is it okay to resort to military force to sort of fight a war effectively. And the thought is you could be a consequentialist. You could say it's okay to fight a war anytime there's going to be better consequences than not fighting a war. But that's one kind of theory. Another very popular, especially historical sort of approach to this is that no, consequentialism is not workable here. What we need is a theory of just war, which basically sets out like, it's kind of divided into when is it okay to start a war? So what are the sort of just causes? So when is it okay to resort to war? And then once you're fighting a war, what are sort of the just methods? So like, what sort of weapons should be outlawed? Who is a legitimate target? Can you kill only soldiers, or can you also kill civilians? Can you kill soldiers when they're injured, or do they have to be fighting and stuff? So just war is the thought that morality governs war. And so there are some illegitimate uses of force. So maybe bombing civilians is illegitimate, or maybe attacking in order to steal territory is illegitimate. And maybe there are some legitimate uses of force. So maybe attacking soldiers in uniform is a legitimate use of force, or maybe defending yourself from an unjustified invader is a legitimate use of force. So that's sort of just war theory. And then she says, we can imagine sort of analogously to a just war theory, a kind of just lie theory. And a just lie theory would say, it's not just the consequences of lies that determine whether they're good. It's, some reasons for lying are okay. So, maybe to save somebody's life, it's okay. And some like methods of lying are okay. She doesn't really go into that, but whatever. You can imagine coming up with a just lie theory the way you come up with a just war theory. And as is hopefully clear by now, the word just here is in terms of justice, not in terms of like only. It's not that usage of just. And then the just lie theory comes up again on 34 to 35, and she says, on a just lie theory, well, you have to come up sort of with a sort of a just cause. So remember, a just lie would have to be sort of for a good reason. So you need a just cause. And then she also goes on to note that pursuing the just war analogy, these criteria involve the justice of means. And so then it's a question of like, how are you going to lie? And like I said, she doesn't really talk about this. What she ends up talking about instead is she says, means involving secrecy and deception, so like lying, would have to be the only alternative to achieving the good end. The harm incurred must not outweigh the good to be attained, and there must be reasonable chance of success in achieving this end through these means. So these three criteria, so the only alternative, the harm can't outweigh the good, and reasonable chance of success. These are criteria that often show up in just war theory for when it's okay to resort to violence. So is it okay to resort to violence? Well, if it's the only alternative, if you can't get it some other way, if you can't negotiate or whatever, if the harm is not going to outweigh the good, so if you're not going to sort of kill more people than you save or something like that, and if there's a reasonable chance of success, so it's not like hopeless, you're not going to kill some people and maybe you'll definitely fail even if you kill the people. So these sort of three concerns you might think you have to sort of check those boxes before you can resort to violence. And so she says, oh, let's sort of see how that would work if you did that with lies also. So that's just to sort of fill out a little bit just war theory, since we haven't seen it and we're not going to see it, and also help you understand like where are these criteria coming from? Like why does she think these are the relevant ones? She's just saying, well, imagine if we're modeling it on just war theory and we take those sort of concerns, what would we say?